I went to the Bitterroot Mountains to forget the sound of gunfire and the weight of a guilty conscience. I built a life out of stone and silence, thinking I was finally alone. I was wrong. When Julian crashed his luxury SUV into my perimeter fence, he didn't just bring a bag full of blood money, he brought a past that was hunting him. He's a straight city boy, with a fiancée waiting in Manhattan, but out here, titles don't matter. Only survival does. Before we start, tell me, have you ever had a single moment change the entire direction of your life? The silence in the mountains isn't empty. It's heavy. It's a physical presence that settles into your bones until you can hear the rhythm of your own heart. For 5 years, that silence was my only friend. My name is Cade. I'm a man who was built for war and discarded by peace. I moved to this cabin to be a ghost, living off the land and keeping my scars hidden under layers of flannel and solitude. The storm hit quite a Tuesday. It started with a sky the color of a bruised lung, followed by a wind that screamed through the pines like a choir of the damned. I was in my shed, oiling my Remington 700, when the sound broke the mountain's peace. It was the shrill, unnatural scream of tires on black ice. A second later, a dull crunch of metal against old-growth oak echoed through the valley. "Bear, stay," I muttered to my Malinois. I didn't need a dog in a blizzard. I grabbed my heavy shearling coat, a tactical light, and a medical kit. My gut told me this wasn't a local. Locals know better than to drive the North Pass during a whiteout. The hike down the slope was a battle. The snow was already knee-deep, swirling in blinding sheets that turned the world into a flat, white void. When I reached the road, I saw the Mercedes. It was a black beast, expensive and out of place, its front end wrapped around a massive cedar tree like a crushed soda can. The driver's door was hanging open, swaying in the wind. The interior was empty, but the scent of high-end cologne, something like citrus and expensive leather, still lingered in the cold air. Then I saw the red. Small, dark droplets of blood were being rapidly buried by the falling snow. They led away from the car, toward a jagged rock formation 50 yards away. I followed them, my heart hammering against my ribs with an old, familiar adrenaline. I found him slumped against a granite shelf. He looked like a mannequin dropped in a freezer. He wore a white silk dress shirt, soaked through and translucent against his pale skin, and a pair of tailored wool trousers. No coat, no gloves. Just a man who had left in a hurry. I knelt beside him, my light cutting through the gloom. His face was a masterpiece of refined bone structure, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and thick, dark lashes. But he was dying. A deep gash on his forehead was weeping crimson, and his lips were the color of a winter twilight. "Hey," I barked, shaking him. "Wake up, kid. You sleep, you don't wake up." His eyes fluttered. They were green, the color of a forest after a rain. He looked at me, and for a split second I saw his throat work as he tried to scream. He saw my beard, my scarred face, and the sheer size of me, and he panicked. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Don't let Marco take it." "Who the hell is Marco?" I asked, but he was already gone. His head fell back against the rock. That's when I saw the bag. He was clutching a heavy leather duffel like it was his own soul. It had unzipped in the crash. Inside, I saw the banded stacks of $100 bills, at least $500,000. I didn't have time to ask questions. I scooped him up. He was lighter than a man his size should be, shivering so violently I could feel his bones rattling against my chest. I grabbed the bag, tucked it under my arm, and began the long, agonizing trek back up to the cabin. Inside the cabin, the heat from the wood stove was an aggressive comfort. I laid him down on the bearskin rug. I had to be clinical. I had to be fast. I stripped the wet, freezing silk from his body. Underneath the designer clothes, he was lean and athletic, but his body was a map of tragedy. His ribs were covered in yellowing bruises, finger marks. Someone had been handling him roughly long before he hit that tree. I wrapped him in 3 layers of heavy wool blankets and sat back in my armchair, watching the firelight dance across his skin. He was a straight city boy, likely a millionaire's son, running from something that money couldn't fix. Around midnight, he woke up. He didn't just wake, he lunged. He sat up with a gasp, his eyes wide and wild. He saw me sitting in the shadows, my face partially obscured by the brim of my hat. "Easy," I said, my voice low and steady. "You're in my home. You're safe." He scrambled back, his spine hitting the woodpile. He looked at his bare chest, then at the duffel bag on my table. He looked back at me, his gaze traveling over my massive frame and the gun rack behind me. Did you see what's in the bag?" he asked. His voice was trembling, but there was a flicker of that straight arrogance, the kind that comes from growing up with a silver spoon. "I saw the money, Julian," I said. He flinched at the use of his name. I'd seen it on his license while I was checking for medical info. "I also saw the wedding ring in your pocket. You want to tell me why an engaged straight arrow like you is bleeding out in my woods with $500,000 in cash?" Julian looked down at his hands. He was twisting a ghost of a ring on his finger, a nervous habit. "I'm not a criminal," he whispered. "It's my money. My family, they aren't who they say they are. My father, my brother, they use the family firm to move things, dark things. I tried to walk away. I told them I wanted out. I was going to marry Eleanor, move to the coast, and never look back." He looked up at me, his green eyes shimmering with a mix of fear and something that looked a lot like longing. "They wouldn't let me go, Cade. Marco, he's my brother's cleaner. He told me I was part of the family, whether I liked it or not. So I took the cash they were moving tonight and I drove. I just wanted to be free." I let out a low, dry laugh. "Freedom costs more than 500 grand, kid, and it usually costs more than a man like you is willing to pay." I stood up and he shrank back into the blankets. I'm 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle and old regrets. I walked over and set a tin mug of coffee on the floor next to him. Our fingers brushed for a heartbeat, a jolt of heat that felt like a localized lightning strike. He pulled back as if he'd been burned. "I'm straight," he said suddenly, his voice defiant. It was a wall he was trying to build between us. "I have a fiancée. I have a life." "I don't care who you sleep with," I growled, though my pulse was ticking a little faster than it should have. "But you aren't getting to any border. The pass is blocked. The road is buried. You're stuck here with me for the next 3 days, which means for the next 72 hours, you belong to me." The next morning was a world of white and gray. I didn't give Julian time to process his trauma. Out here, the only way to keep the dark thoughts away is to work until your muscles scream. I took him out to the woodpile. He looked ridiculous in my oversized flannel and work boots, his delicate hands swallowed by the sleeves. "Pick up the maul," I commanded. I've never done this," he said, looking at the heavy splitting axe. "I have people who do this for me." "Your people aren't coming, Julian. Grab the handle." I stood behind him to show him the form. I didn't expect the reaction my body had. I wrapped my arms around him, my chest pressing against his back, my large, scarred hands covering his soft ones on the wood. He was warm, impossibly warm, and he smelled like the expensive soap he'd used before the world fell apart. I felt his heart jump, a quick, frantic thud against his ribs. He didn't pull away. He leaned back into me, just a fraction of an inch, seeking the solidity of my frame. "Legs apart," I muttered near his ear. My beard brushed his neck, and I saw the goosebumps rise on his skin. Focus. Aim for the ground through the wood. Don't think about the axe. Think about the men who hurt you. He took a shaky breath. "I've got it," he whispered. I stepped back. The loss of his heat felt like a physical wound. Julian raised the axe and swung. He missed. He hit the stump. He dropped the tool and cursed, his eyes welling with frustrated tears. "Again," I said. For 2 hours he worked. I watched the way the sweat began to soak through the flannel. I watched the way he gritted his teeth, his city boy pride refusing to let him quit in front of me. Every time he looked at me, the straight mask was slipping. He wasn't looking at me like a savior. He was looking at me like a man he wanted to touch. He finally split a log. The crack was as loud as a gunshot. He looked at me, a genuine boyish smile breaking through his exhaustion. "I did it!" "One down," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Now do the rest." We worked in a strange, charged silence until noon. As we walked back toward the cabin, the wind shifted. Bear stood on the porch, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his throat. I looked down the valley. Through the trees, I saw it, a single dark silhouette of a snowmobile, cutting through the white void toward us. It wasn't the police. It was a black machine, fast and silent. "Get inside," I ordered, my hand dropping to the holster on my hip. "Who is it?" Julian asked, his face turning pale. "It's your past, Julian," I said, pushing him toward the door. "And it looks like they didn't want to wait for the snow to melt." I stepped onto the porch and chambered around into my rifle. The straight boy was behind me, the money was on the table, and the monsters were at the gate. But they didn't know one thing. They were on my mountain now, and in these woods, I was the king of the monsters. The snowmobile didn't roar, it hissed. It was a high-end, matte black machine designed for stealth, cutting through the drifts like a shark through water. I stood on the porch, my Remington 700 rested casually against my shoulder, but my finger was already finding the familiar curve of the trigger. "Cade, what's happening?" Julian's voice came from behind the heavy oak door. It was thin, brittle with a fear he couldn't hide. "Stay away from the windows," I ordered, "and stay quiet. If you hear shooting, crawl under the workbench and don't come out until I tell you." The snowmobile stopped 50 yards out, just beyond the reach of the porch light's amber glow. The rider hopped off. He was tall, dressed in a tactical winter parka that looked like it cost more than my cabin. He didn't look like a mountain man. He looked like a professional. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that was sharp, handsome, and cold as the ice beneath his boots. Marco. "This is private property," I called out, my voice carrying through the crisp air, "and I'm not in a social mood." Marco smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for a friend, a city boy who took a wrong turn. He's got something that belongs to my employer. You return the boy and the bag, and I'll pretend I never saw this shack. The boy is guest. The bag is his. And the only thing you're leaving with is a head start back down the mountain before I change my mind about letting you live." Marco's smile vanished. He didn't reach for a weapon yet, but his stance shifted, the subtle weight transfer of a trained killer. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old man. You're out of your league." "I've buried men in 3 different continents who told me the exact same thing," I said, stepping into the light so he could see the scars on my neck and the dead look in my eyes. "Now get on your toy and leave." I didn't wait for him to respond. I stepped back inside and bolted the door. Julian was standing in the middle of the room, clutching one of my heavy wool blankets to his chest. He looked like he was about to shatter. "Is it him?" he whispered. "Is it Marco?" "It's him," I said, checking the sidearm at my hip. "He's alone for now, which means he's scouting, but he didn't come here to talk." Julian sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "He'll kill you, Cade. You don't know him. He's a monster. I should just go. I should just give them the money." I walked over and stood between his knees, forcing him to look up at me. I grabbed his chin, my thumb brushing the stubble that was starting to darken his jawline. "Look at me," I growled. He looked. His emerald eyes were swimming with tears, but behind the fear, I saw that spark of straight defiance again. "I don't care about the money, Julian. I care about the fact that you ran to find a life worth living. If you walk out that door now, you aren't just giving them the bag, you're giving them your soul. Is that what you want?" "No," he choked out. "Then you stay behind me. I am the shield. You understand?" He nodded, a single tear escaping and rolling down his cheek. I did something I hadn't done in a decade. I leaned down and pressed my forehead against his. It wasn't a kiss, it was a vow. The heat between us was suffocating, a silent promise of protection that felt more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. "I'm straight," he whispered against my skin, his voice trembling. "I have a fiancée. This isn't supposed to happen." "The mountains don't care about supposed to, kid," I muttered. The first shot didn't come from the front. It came from the rear window. Crack! The glass shattered, shards spraying across the kitchen table. Julian screamed and hit the floor. I was already moving, diving across the room to extinguish the lanterns. Total darkness swallowed the cabin, save for the orange glow of the wood stove embers. Marco wasn't alone. He'd had a second man on a second sled circling the back. "Crawl to the cellar door," I yelled over the wind that was now whistling through the broken pane. I took a position by the corner of the wall, peeking out. I saw a flash of muzzle fire from the tree line. I returned fire, 2 quick rounds from the Remington. A grunt of pain echoed from the woods. I'd hit someone, but I didn't know how bad. "Cade, my leg!" Julian cried out. I spun around. He hadn't been hit by a bullet, but a heavy iron pot had fallen from the shelf in the chaos, pinning his ankle against the cellar frame. He was trapped in the open. I didn't think. I sprinted across the room, glass crunching under my boots. Another shot hissed past my ear, embedding itself in the log wall with a wet thwack. I reached Julian, threw my body over his, and used my sheer weight to shield him. "I've got you," I panted. I shoved the pot aside and dragged him into the darkness of the cellar hallway. We were inches apart, panting in the dark. The scent of gunpowder and pine was overwhelming. Julian was clutching my shirt, his fingers digging into my muscle. "You're bleeding," he whispered, his hand finding the wet warmth on my shoulder. A piece of glass had grazed me. "I've had worse," I said. In the silence that followed, we heard the heavy thud of a boot on the porch. Marco was at the door. "Julian!" Marco's voice boomed, sounding eerily calm. "I know you're in there. Your straight arrow fiancée called me, you know. She told me where you were heading. She doesn't want you back, Jules. She just wants her share of the inheritance. You're alone. Come out, and I'll make it quick." Julian went still. The betrayal hit him harder than any bullet. He looked at me in the dark, his eyes searching for a reason to keep fighting. I reached out and cupped the back of his neck, pulling him close until our lips were a breath away. "You aren't alone," I whispered, and then I did what I'd been fighting since the moment I saw him in the snow. I kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hard, and tasted of salt and adrenaline. It was the taste of 2 men who were supposed to be enemies, or strangers, or straight, finally admitting the truth while the world burned outside. Julian didn't pull away. He made a low, needy sound in the back of his throat and kissed me back, his hands tangling in my hair. For 5 seconds, the hunters didn't exist. The money didn't exist. There was only the heat. I pulled away, my chest heaving. "Stay here. I'm going to finish this." I grabbed my tactical knife from my belt and stood up. Marco was kicking at the door. He thought he was walking into a cabin with a scared boy and an old man. He was wrong. He was walking into a slaughterhouse. The front door groaned under the weight of Marco's boot. He was rhythmic, patient, the kind of man who enjoyed the terror of the hunt as much as the kill. "Julian?" Marco's voice was a jagged blade. "I can hear your heart beating through the wood, Jules. It's the only thing about you that isn't a lie." I looked at Julian. He was shivering, but it wasn't the cold anymore. It was the realization that his entire life, his fiancée, his family, his straight reputation had been a setup. He looked at the gold band on his finger, the symbol of the prison he'd almost walked into. "Give me the knife," Julian whispered. I looked at him, my brow furrowing. "Stay in the cellar, kid. I'm the one who does the killing." "No," Julian said, and for the first time his voice didn't shake. He stood up, the oversized flannel shirt hanging off his shoulders, his green eyes burning with a cold, hard light. "He's right. My whole life was a lie. But this cabin, the snow, what happened between us, that's the only real thing I've ever felt. I'm not hiding anymore." I saw the change in him. The city boy was dead. I reached into my boot and pulled out a backup serrated blade, handing it to him handle first. "Don't hesitate. In the woods, if you hesitate, you're just meat." I grabbed my Remington and slipped out the back window into the howling whiteout. I didn't want to fight Marco inside. I wanted him in the trees, where the mountain could help me kill him. The blizzard was a wall of needles. I moved through the pines like a ghost, my white camo poncho making me invisible against the drifts. I saw the second man first, a hired gun, crouched near the woodshed with a suppressed submachine gun. He was looking for a target in the windows. He never looked behind him. I moved with a silence earned in the jungles of the East. I didn't waste a bullet. I came up behind him, grabbed his chin, and drove my tactical knife into the base of his skull. He went down without a sound, his blood turning the snow into a dark, steaming slush. One down. I turned back toward the cabin. Marco had breached the front door. I saw the orange glow of the interior light spilling out onto the porch. "Julian!" I heard Marco scream. I sprinted toward the porch, but someone was faster. Julian had emerged from the cellar, but he hadn't stayed in the shadows. He was standing in the middle of the room, the duffel bag in his hand. He looked like a lamb offering himself to a wolf. "Here!" Julian shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. "You want the money, Marco? Come and get it!" Marco stepped into the center of the room, his pistol leveled at Julian's chest. "You always were a disappointing little shit, Jules. Eleanor said you were soft. She said you'd fold the moment things got cold." "Eleanor doesn't know me," Julian said, his eyes flicking toward the broken window where I was positioned, "and neither do you." Julian threw the bag, not to Marco, but at the wood stove. The heavy leather hit the iron door, and Julian dove behind the heavy oak kitchen table. Marco instinctively tracked the bag, his greed winning over his training for a split second. That was the second I needed. I fired through the window. The bullet caught Marco in the shoulder, spinning him around. He roared in pain, firing blindly at the window. I dropped to the snow, the rounds wood-chipping the log frame above my head. "Cade!" Julian screamed. Marco was wounded, but he was a professional. He ignored the blood soaking his parka and lunged for the table where Julian was hiding. He grabbed Julian by the hair, dragging him up and pressing the hot barrel of the pistol against his temple. "Come out, old man," Marco screamed at the darkness outside, "or I'll paint the walls with the straight boy's brains." I stepped onto the porch, my rifle lowered. My heart was a drum in my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. I didn't care about the mission. I didn't care about the mountain. I only cared about the man with the emerald eyes. "Let him go, Marco," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The money is right there. Take it and leave." "It was never just about the money," Marco spat, his face contorted. "It was about the insult. He thought he could just leave us? He thought he could be this? He shoved his gun harder into Julian's head. Julian looked at me. He wasn't crying. He looked at me with a calm, absolute clarity. "Cade," Julian said softly, "it's okay." In that moment, Julian didn't wait for me to save him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the gold wedding ring, and jammed it into the wound in Marco's shoulder. Marco screamed, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Julian dropped to the floor, and I didn't miss. I fired a single round. It took Marco in the center of the chest, throwing him back through the open doorway and onto the frozen porch. He didn't move again. The wolf was dead. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had died down to a whisper. I dropped the rifle and ran into the cabin, sliding on the floor to reach Julian. He was sitting against the table, gasping for air, his face covered in Marco's blood. I grabbed his face in my hands, checking for injuries. "Are you hit? Talk to me." Julian looked at me, then at the ring lying on the floor, covered in blood. He picked it up and tossed it into the open fire of the wood stove. "I'm fine," Julian whispered. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched the scar on my cheek. I'm finally me." I pulled him into my arms, holding him with a fierce, possessive strength. I didn't care about the bodies on the porch. I didn't care about the millions in the bag. "You're staying," I muttered into his hair. "He'll stay," he promised. 3 months later, the snow had melted into crystal-clear streams that rushed down the mountain. The Bitterroot was green again. I was on the porch, fixing a broken hinge, when Julian walked out. He wasn't the city boy anymore. His skin was tanned, his muscles had filled out from months of labor, and he wore a pair of old denim jeans like they were a second skin. He didn't look like a millionaire's son. He looked like a man who belonged to the mountain. He walked over and leaned against the railing, looking out at the valley. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers interlocking with mine. There were no rings, no lies. "The plow is coming up tomorrow," Julian said. "The first time the road has been clear since the crash." I looked at him, my heart tight. "You want to go back?" Julian turned to me, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face. He leaned in, kissing me deeply, a kiss that tasted of pine, coffee, and home. "I am back," he whispered. The straight boy was gone, and in his place, I had found the only thing worth saving. Julian and I found our peace in the shadows of the Bitterroot, far from the lies of the city and the expectations of a world that never truly knew us. But every ending is just the beginning of a new chronicle. If you felt the heat between the mountain and the city boy today, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss our next story, where the stakes are even higher and the secrets even deeper. And if you enjoyed this journey, smash that like button to help other brothers find their way to our cabin. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Julian gave up $1 million inheritance and a perfect life just to feel real for the first time. What is the one thing you've walked away from to finally be yourself? Drop your story in the comments below. I'll be down there reading, and I might just pin the most powerful one. Until the next chronicle, stay true.